This is Love Notes, daily devotions from Holy Trinity Lutheran Church. Grace and peace to you. Today we're going to start a new series on the Gospel of Luke. As one of the four Gospels, it is our source for understanding the story of Jesus. Luke's Gospel is quite beloved. Many of the favorite stories people have about Jesus come from Luke's Gospel. Luke's Gospel is paired with a second volume, which is the book of Acts. Luke is the author of each, and they should be read in succession. Luke's Gospel, of course, tells the story of Jesus and has lots of overlap with the other Gospels, but it also has a very unique perspective and a unique purpose. So as we explore the Gospel of Luke, we'll be exploring what Luke has to tell us about Jesus. The first four verses, which are what we're looking at today, are kind of an introduction to what Luke is up to, and they give us some clues as to how Luke is approaching this particular project. It says, "Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us." Let me stop there. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account. This acknowledges that Luke is aware of other stories of Jesus out there. There are actually more Gospels than just the four that are in the Bible. There are Gospels that didn't make it, if you will. Sometimes they were rejected because they were just plain weird. Sometimes they were rejected because they could not be credited to people who were eyewitnesses of Jesus and his life, death, and resurrection. What we have are four diverse ways of talking about Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, although they overlap. Luke has some varied sources, and he's probably using some of these things that many have undertaken to write down to make his own gospel. For instance, we can see in both Matthew and Luke signs of Mark's gospel, which is the oldest of the gospels. Written in probably the late 60s or 70s, just before or after the fall of Jerusalem, Mark's gospel is kind of a basic text that the other two synoptic gospels use as a framework for their story of Jesus. In fact, 1/3 of the Gospel of Luke is paralleled in the Gospel of Mark. Luke also has another source which gives him parallels with Matthew's Gospel. They both seem to have access to some assorted collection of Jesus' sayings, parables, teachings, little snippets of stories. In biblical scholarship, this is often called Q for the German word Quelle or source. We don't have a copy of that to date. It got kind of fused in with Matthew and Luke, so there wasn't much reason to keep it around. But because of the overlap between Matthew and Luke, we know that this source likely existed and provided much of the teaching material that is not in Mark, but is in Matthew and Luke. Luke tells us in the second verse, just as they, the other accounts, were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Those are the two qualifications. They followed Jesus and they were eyewitnesses to his life, death, and resurrection. That gives this gospel a character of being apostolic, handed down from generation to generation from those who were first with Jesus. It then tells us in verse 3, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you. This orderly account makes this a particular type of Greco-Roman literature. This sort of introduction would be found in medical or historical texts, and Luke seems to be aligning himself with that discipline. That may fuel a little bit why some people think that Luke is a physician. That and some of the references to healing that are found throughout the gospel, though we can't be really sure about that. Luke is also often identified as the traveling companion of Paul. We can't really prove that either. It doesn't say so directly in the book, but there are some signs that make that a plausible idea. He says that he is doing this and writing it for someone called Most Excellent Theophilus. Theophilus is a common name in the Greek world of Luke's day. Theophilus simply means friend of God. Now, that makes it kind of interesting as to whether Theophilus, on the one hand, is a person who has the name friend of God that Luke is supplying this to. And there are some signs throughout this book that Luke is trying to make a kind of apologetic case for Christianity to perhaps a Roman official or to someone who is in a position of power, and that may be who this Theophilus is. The other side of the coin is that Theophilus may be a kind of a nom de plume for all Christians who are friends of God. So Luke is writing this to anybody who's interested and is a friend of God, as has been revealed in Jesus Christ. Luke goes on to say, so that you may know the truth concerning things about which you have been instructed. Knowing the truth might be a witness, again, to maybe a Roman official, but this last piece of information that says, so that you may know the truth about the things that you've been instructed in, seems to suggest that whoever is receiving this has been catechized, has been taught the faith in some particular way. And so this book is intended to be a resource to lift that up and to establish it more deeply in the life of the reader. Theophilus could very well be you and me, who've been catechized and brought up in the church to one degree or another, and who now have the Gospel of Luke offered to us as a way of understanding more deeply who this Jesus is and what he has to do with us. So, my excellent Theophilus, friend of God, we begin today our adventure in understanding who this Jesus is through the eyes of Luke the evangelist. May our time together be blessed.